Great pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation from Keith and Margaret and colleagues. I have something of a history with this part of the world in that I got my proper grounding in economics while doing a master's degree in Mike's institution in McMaster. The truth is that my primary objective for the year was to convince the fellow student who I had followed from Dublin that she should marry me. And this worked out okay, so that's left me with a very positive view of this part of the world. And it's always very nice to be back. What I want to talk about, and very much taking on from where Margaret situated the entire session, workshop, conference, but also today's opening session, is of course that the big picture context is that rising inequality in the rich countries, and I should say from the outset that everything I say is going to be about the rich countries, is seen as such a widespread concern now, not so much in and of itself, although that of course is central, but because it's seen to be associated with stagnation in what get variously labeled as ordinary living standards, middle class squeeze, and so on. And that this has been a long-term process over the last 30 or 40 years, very significantly compounded by the impacts of the crisis, the Great Recession. Now, to set up the straw man, if you like, the way this often gets talked about is as if this process is sweeping across the rich countries in a way that's pretty much inexorably externally driven by globalization and technological change. And the combination of these two forces are simply hollowing out the middle, driving up inequality, driving down improvements in ordinary living standards, and creating all the challenges that we're now all too familiar with, not just in terms of managing our economies and promoting inclusive growth, but in terms of the political responses, which are very widely seen to be undermining the entire if you like, social, economic, and political models of the rich countries that were built up so successfully, particularly in the 30 years after the Second World War. So I guess what I'll be trying to do is show you some of the numbers that we've come up with in the research program that I lead, and try and convince you, first of all, that these would underpin a rather more nuanced story than the straw man that I've just outlined for you, because essentially experiences across rich countries are actually widely varied in ways that I'll try and bring out. But that doesn't undermine the case for promoting inclusive growth and setting the promotion of inclusive growth as the central aim of our economic and social policies. So just to get the ad out of the way, what I'm talking about is going to be based on these two books from that came out from my research program last year. They're a sort of a twin track approach. The first is a set of structured country case studies where we looked at 10 rich countries and their experiences since around 1980 through a common analytical framework and analytical lens. And there's what I would recommend to you is a very interesting indeed chapter about Canada, which was written by Lars Osberg, with whom many of you will know. And then that's complemented by the in-house effort in the second book, where the research team in Oxford did a comparative analysis, focused on the same issues, and came up with a complementary set of findings, if you like. So this was to try and combine what you can learn from comparative analysis with what you need to know about the intricacies and specificities of the individual countries that you're looking at. So to start with, what's been happening to income inequality over the period since around 1980 across the rich countries? The first thing I'm going to show you is what's happened to the most widely used measure of overall income inequality, the Gini coefficient, which tries to summarize in one number the overall level of inequality in the distribution. And crucially, this is based on information from household surveys. And what you'll see here is that, first of all, so this shows the increase in the Gini, or for the countries down the bottom, the no change or modest decline that has been experienced as far as we can tell from the numbers that we put together, and that's a whole other story. And you could find different numbers that would tell a rather different story for some of these countries. But this is my best stab. And what you will see, first of all, is that a simple summary statement that says income inequality has risen across the rich countries hides as much as it reveals. In that what's really striking here is the degree of variation. And you go from the very, very substantial increases in inequality captured this way that you see in countries such as the United States, big shock, but also, maybe more surprisingly, Sweden, some of the transition countries that were formerly state socialist, and a range of other countries. But reading on down, you see down at the bottom countries where inequality has been stable or has actually declined a bit. And again, key message is, if you pick a different time period, you'll probably get a different answer for some of these countries, such as Greece, for example. Whereas if you focus on the recent period through the crisis, inequality has soared. But if you go back to 1980, you get a rather different picture overall. Now, naturally, Canada is of particular interest. And again, it's the case that for Canada, what you see depends on, most importantly, when you start the clock counting and how far up you come. So you could get a rather larger increase in inequality in Canada by a different selection of time periods. But if you try and harmonize around 1980 and 2016, what you see is that there has been some increase in overall income inequality across the entire distribution, as captured by surveys, in Canada. But it's a relatively modest increase compared to many of the other rich countries. So that's important. What about the current level of inequality? Well, again, if you look at 2016 and you try to situate Canada, you see that now, wouldn't it have been true in 1980 or 1990, but now Canada's level of overall income inequality captured this way is not very different from a rough average of the OECD countries or the rich countries. Might be marginally above the average, but not much. So, for example, if you were to compare the level of inequality in Canada relative to Great Britain, to the UK, in 1980 versus now, inequality has gone up a great deal more in the UK, and the two are much more closely aligned than they were then. But you get a rather different picture, and here I'm going to leave the heavy lifting to Mike. You get a rather different picture if you rely instead on a measure of inequality that has captured a lot of the headlines over the last decade, through the crisis and since. And that is the share of total income of households that goes to the top, that goes to the top 1%, or indeed the top 0.1%, where the results are often even starker in terms of trends. Now here the story for Canada is different. If you look around, and one limitation is we don't have these numbers for all the rich countries I was looking at a minute ago. We have them for a subset. Thanks to a really impressive collaborative research effort over the past 15 or 20 years, driven by people like Thomas Piketty and Tony Atkinson, and with, as I say, the heavy lifting done by Mike, as he will talk about, and colleagues in Canada. The picture for Canada here is that Canada started in 1980 with a relatively high share of total income going to the top. And the increase that has been seen over the period since then has also been above average. Not, of course, as dramatic as the increase that we see right along the side here for the US, which started from a very high base and has seen an absolutely remarkable increase, an approximate doubling of the share of total income going to the very top, from about 10% to a really remarkable 20%. So Canada is not the US, guess what? But it has seen a marked increase in inequality in income measured this way. Now, one of the real challenges for income inequality researchers, like myself and Mike, over the last 10 years, and there's lots and lots of work still needing to be done on this, is to try and reconcile and harmonize and get a consistent picture from these two different windows onto income inequality, these two different perspectives. But the first thing to say is that these income shares relate to income before tax, and they relate to individuals rather than households, and they take no account of the size and composition of the household. So that's a marked and important difference in concept, and there are lots of underlying differences in the way these numbers are constructed and derived that we can get into in the discussion. But these are two different perspectives that for Canada, and Canada isn't that unusual, for quite a few other countries, these tell rather different stories. But I want to get on rather rapidly to what is the other half of what I want to talk to you about. And that is, how does inequality in income, on the one hand, relate to income growth for, quote, ordinary working households, if we think that expression has any meaning. So as you'll well know, there are a whole plethora of ways of trying to capture the ambiguous notion of inclusive growth. There are batteries of indicators and indicator sets developed by, not least, the OECD, that we'll hear about from Marco later today, by the IMF and by national governments and by a range of other bodies. Without in any way undermining the value of those sometimes quite elaborate and complex sets of indicators, the one I want to focus your attention on is what happens to the level of income going to the middle of the distribution, the median of the household income distribution, having taken household size into account to arrive at a measure that tells you something about the living standards that households around the middle can afford, and more particularly in this context, how much has that changed? How much has the real purchasing power of income in the middle of the distribution risen over the period from around 1980, or as close to that as we can get? Now, I'm not in any sense holding this up as a replacement for these indicator sets, or as the best measure of, if you for some reason were driven to rely on one number, is this the best number? It's a good number. That's as much as I would claim. It's a number to which we should be paying significant attention. And it's particularly relevant to the debates that we started with about, for example, the squeezed middle, and about the extent to which ordinary living standards have failed to grow alongside growth in GDP. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But what has happened to that number leads you into a lot of complexities with the data and the available data from household surveys that doesn't always allow us to go back to 1980, unfortunately, but we've done our best to go back as far as we can for as many countries as we can. And what that leaves you with is data often that covers, in a patchy fashion, say every fifth year, for example, you might have in comparative data sets such as the Luxembourg Income Study and the data constructed by the OECD. So what we're looking at is cash income after taxes and transfers in the middle of the distribution. Now, this is how countries rank when you look at this indicator as your, if you like, key performance measure. So what you can see is, again, there's an absolutely striking variation rather than commonality across the rich countries in this performance indicator. Now, as it happens, the best performing country on the right here happens to be the one that I come from, that's good news. Strikingly, when I'm talking in Ireland, this is what I get the most grief about, because people find this hard to believe, but it's what the numbers suggest. And it's very important to say that unlike numbers that you see about, for example, GDP, this number is not polluted by things like transfer pricing and the attribution of Apple's profits to Ireland. This is a concrete measure of income that actually flows to households located, living in the country in question. So, but I'm not here to talk about Ireland. What you will be much more interested in is where does Canada rank? Well, down the other end of the spectrum. So there are countries where there has been no growth in real incomes around the middle, or where that has actually fallen, such as Japan and Greece. Countries where there's been really unimpressive growth of the order of only about 0.5% in real terms per year on average. And countries like the US, Germany, and Canada, which haven't done much better than that. Now again, an alert is that this number is particularly variable for Canada from one sub-period to the next. And you can pick a sub-period or a different starting point that will give you, or importantly, a different end point that will give you a higher number, a higher average for Canada. But over the entire period from about 1980 to 2016, this is the number that we come up with. Some countries have done a bit better, countries like France, Denmark, the Netherlands, and some have done really quite a lot better, Sweden, the UK, and Norway. So what will strike you immediately is that, as I say, those sets of countries, these are not countries that we generally think of as fitting in a group together. And that's as striking. So we have what I want to very quickly talk about is, to what extent is this performance of the median valid as a measure of growth lower down the distribution? So to what extent do incomes in or around the bottom 10%, for example, or the lower bottom, say 20 or 25th percentile of the distribution, to what extent does there's performance there mirror performance with respect to the median? And that's what this chart shows. And the short answer is it doesn't. And in many countries, income growth around or near the bottom, as measured here by the comparison between income growth for the middle and income growth at the income point that cuts off the bottom 10%, which gets labeled P10, for the most part, the bottom has failed to keep up with the middle. And that's in a context where the middle has generally failed to keep up with the top. So that this median is not an all-purpose indicator. If you want to know what's happened to real living standards among the poor, for most countries, they've done significantly worse. And down at the bottom, you'll see that the US, for all the modesty of the improvement in median or middle living standards, living standards lower down the distribution have actually worsened, as captured by cash income. And that's an important caveat that I want to come back to. But for Canada, in fact, while incomes towards the bottom have lagged modestly behind the middle, the gap is much more modest than it is in most of the rich countries. So what that tells you is most of the action in terms of inequality, and in the Canadian case, as Mike will elaborate on, is towards the top rather than the bottom. That's not the case in lots of other countries. But to get to the relationship between these two, so I've been talking about inequality and talking about ordinary living standards. What is the relationship between the two? What I started with was setting out the sort of common narrative that rising inequality has undermined ordinary living standards and improvements in those. And this has generated a whole stream of research and stream of speculations as to how inequality or rising inequality, often not quite clear which of the two, but high inequality or rising inequality could be undermining economic growth. And by doing so, undermining our capacity to generate improvements in ordinary living standards. I won't go through the list of channels on the slide through which it's speculated, or sometimes argued, that rising inequality, high inequality, undermine economic growth. And in doing so, undermine growth in the median. And of course, there's a direct effect in that if all the income growth is going to the top, all the growth in GDP is going to the top, well, then you're not going to see much growth in the middle. So if we put these two sets of data together about inequality and about growth, and we look at sub-periods, so roughly 5-year periods, and we compare, we just do a scattergram of the change in inequality and the improvement in ordinary living standards over these 5-year periods, so each dot is a 5-year period for a country, what we see is it's all over the place, to be technical in summarizing this pattern. If you wanted to, you could see a very modest negative relationship, so that where inequality was going up, the improvement in living standards was maybe modestly less. But when you do the numbers properly, what you find is that there is a modest and not very robust negative relationship between some measures of income inequality and growth in the median in the country and sub-period in question. So you can get a significant coefficient, which of course, as we all know, is absolutely crucial to getting your article published. But the more important point is that even where you get unrobust but sometimes significant effects, controlling for other things that we think affect economic growth, which of course we're not very good at explaining in the first place, taking inequality, crudely speaking, taking inequality and what's happened to inequality into account is not very much additional help in understanding, explaining, predicting what happened to ordinary living standards over the period in question. So, I mean, this partly reflects the enormous complexity of the potential channels of influence and the varying lengths of time over which we would expect these influences to make themselves felt. So if we take, for example, a channel that's been very much emphasized by the OECD, that is that rising inequality makes social mobility from one generation to the next more difficult, and therefore leaves you in a situation where essentially the economy is failing to exploit the productive potential of people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds who are failing to achieve their potential through the education system and in work. But of course, that's going to take a very long time to work its way through. We wouldn't expect to see immediate results from such a channel, which may well be operating. So what I'm saying is we don't see striking impacts of inequality in damping down economic growth and income growth around the middle when we look over this period from 1980 for the rich countries. So the US is distinctive, is the key message. The US is a striking example of the combination of high initial and rapidly rising inequality going together with stagnation or even decline in living standards around and below the middle. That's not the common pattern. In fact, you can see a whole variety of different combinations of inequality and median income growth. You see countries where there's been stagnation, but not much rise in inequality, like Japan and Italy. And you can read down through this. And the last bullet refers to Canada. I just forgot to put in the dash. So you see a whole variety of different combinations and permutations of the relationship between inequality levels and changes and what has happened to income growth around the middle. So where does that leave us? Well, very importantly, it leaves us still with a very different picture of how the world operates, to the ones that you learn in Economics 101, and that you very often are expected to believe throughout your career as an economist. There is no positive relationship between inequality and growth. In other words, higher inequality does not fuel economic growth, and it does not lead to higher, it is not compensated for, if you like, or required to bring about rapid growth or significant growth in incomes around and below the middle. So that trickle-down notion is pretty comprehensively exploded by the experiences of the rich countries over the last 30 or 40 years. And that's entirely consistent with comparative studies looking over this or a similar period for the rich countries and more generally by for example, the OECD and the IMF, which either find no evidence or find evidence that inequality actually undermines growth. So that's fundamentally important and not at all and completely supported by what I'm finding. I'm just going to say very briefly that one of the things that people tend to focus on is the shortfall, the gap divergence between growth in incomes around the middle or for ordinary households and GDP. And that growth is significant in the case of Canada, but again, it's not by any means to be simply explained by what's happened to inequality. Rising inequality is a contributory factor and a significant contributory factor, but so are a variety of other factors. And inequality growth in and of itself only accounts for a quarter of a third of the gap between median income growth and GDP growth. So key messages, I'm not going to repeat because I hope you've got them from what I was saying, from the way I presented it. But really, that the comparative picture is much more nuanced than the US picture that tends to dominate commentary and indeed research, particularly in economics. Crucially, rising inequality and stagnating living standards as a combination are absolutely not unavoidable products of inexorable forces of globalization and technology, which of course themselves are not exogenous, are under, to a significant extent, they're things we can control, we don't have to take for granted. So saying that tackling inequality is absolutely not a magic bullet for promoting growth and promoting ordinary living standards is not to in any way undermine the centrality that inclusive growth should have as the main aim of economic and social policy. And that can be justified in and of itself as our economic and social goal. It doesn't need to be justified in an instrumental way by saying we need to tackle inequality in order to promote growth. So we need a battery of potentially mutually reinforcing policies to address inequality while promoting growth. And what I've listed here towards the end, and I don't want to give the chair an ulcer at this hour of the morning, what I've listed here is the very large range of things we have to think about in trying to construct an overarching strategy to promote inclusive growth, starting with the parameters of macroeconomic, fiscal and monetary policy themselves, which certainly in some periods, in some countries, have been the constraint on promoting inclusive growth, adequate inclusive growth. And you can certainly point to periods in, for example, the history of the UK where that's been the case quite recently. And Lars Osberg at least would argue you can point to periods in Canada where monetary policy in particular has potentially damped down growth unnecessarily at crucial stages. Just to say what magic bullets are not going to be enough, improving education in and of itself is not enough, has been seen not to be enough, nor is rising employment rates or close to full employment. And we don't have to look around very far to see countries which have promoted education and have successfully and have high employment rates, but haven't managed to generate much income growth at or below the middle of the distribution. So what is the combination that you need? Well, if you look at these countries over time, what you see is that most of the countries that have been relatively successful have combined employment growth, and in particular rising levels of employment for women, with real income with real wage growth, with growth in hourly wages in real terms. There's a battery of what get now labeled as pre-distribution policies that one can point to. I've listed a whole range of them here, some more controversial than others, including, for example, taking direct measures to limit top pay. Investing in education with a very specific focus on disadvantage and those facing barriers to mobility, for example. So it's not to say that education doesn't matter, but a blanket education policy that's not focused won't work. And just to finish with the in a sense obvious but can't be repeated too often point, I think, that direct redistribution has a central role to play. There's been a trend in recent times to say it's all about the pre-distribution, it's all about market incomes, it's not about redistribution. Redistribution has been shown to fail. And while market inequality absolutely matters, the scope for strengthening redistribution in many countries is substantial, and if inequality is to be tackled while promoting inclusive growth, there is no avoiding strengthening of direct redistribution of income and of wealth along the lines that I've set out here, which I hope gives you something to bite on in what I'm sure will be an interesting discussion. Thank you.